Welcome to our first debate. My name is Alvin Du, and this is Raghav Jujare, and today we'll be debating on this question: is the New Testament historically reliable, and was it telling the truth? Now, as the terms of the debate was that there is no time limits, and that there will be no facilitator. I will be your somewhat facilitator. But how this will work is that I will go first because I am arguing in the affirmative, and Raghav will go next, then followed with my response to his, and then we'll start a discussion back and forth. All right? Ready? Let me begin. Now, the question we both have to answer today is whether or not the New Testament is historically reliable and is telling the truth. Now, as this is two questions, there is only one answer to them both. Now, the evidence for the reliability and the trustworthiness of the Bible is unparalleled and paramount, as my opponent will try to argue that so-called errors in the Bible will disprove the truth of the New Testament. This is just as false as statements can be. As you will see, the argument for the New Testament far surpasses any attempts to discredit it by its uses of small and insignificant examples, while the evidence for the New Testament comprises of the broad spectrum of New Testament evidence in 8 points, and these all start with the letter E: early testimony, eyewitness testimony, elaborate testimony, embarrassing testimony, exigent testimony, excruciating testimony, and expected testimony, and extra biblical testimony. But before that, we have to discuss whether or not we have an accurate copy of what the New Testament says. To compare the number of manuscripts, the Greek writer Homer has 1,800 manuscripts, dated 500 years between the original and the first surviving copies. Diogenes, another Greek writer, has 200, but with a time gap of 1,400 years between the original and the first surviving copies. Now, Herodotus, a Greek historian, has 20 with a time gap of 1,000 years. Plato has 7 with a time gap of 1,200 years. Right? Titus, a Roman historian, has 20 with a time gap of 1,000 years. Now, here's this. The New Testament has 5,800 Greek manuscripts, with the first surviving copies being 35 years after the resurrection. Right? In the same source, Diogenes, Herodotus, Plato, Titus, all cannot be uncovered of how accurate those are. Homer has an accuracy of 95%. The New Testament has an accuracy of 99.5%. Right? The John Rylands fragment is the earliest undisputed fragment we have, and that is John 18:31 to 33, 37 to 38. It was dated around 117 AD. It was originally written in 95. Some say it's earlier, because it was found in Egypt across the Mediterranean. Because it was found across the Mediterranean, people argue that because it was traveled so far and that therefore it was in Egypt, therefore there must have been more copies before the John Rylands fragment. There are nine disputed fragments found with the Dead Sea Scrolls that include parts of Mark, Acts, Romans, 1 Timothy, 2 Peter, and James. These were dated 50 AD, about 20 years after the New Testament. See, furthermore, the beginning of February 303 until 311 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered persecution on Christians because he believed that Christianity broke the covenants between Rome and her gods. The order called for the destruction of churches, manuscript books, and Christians. Nearly all biblical manuscripts were destroyed, but Christianity still stayed. This was because the church fathers cited the New Testament over 36,289 times. These people are Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Tertullian. If you include all the church fathers, there are over 1 million citations just to the New Testament, right? Just by reading the quotes from people, you can reconstruct the New Testament just on that. This proves that the New Testament copies were already in circulation. Now, for the record, we do not have any original copies from the New Testament, but nor do we have any original copies from any significant literature from the ancient world. So we must use textual criticism to compare and contrast the manuscripts together. Some critics say that there are over 200,000 errors in all the manuscripts, but this is highly misleading. The vast majority of these quote-unquote errors are strictly grammatical. Furthermore, a spelling error in one manuscript that is found in 2,000 manuscripts are counted as 2,000 errors, not one error, drastically inflating the number. Philip Schaff calculated that of the 150,000 variants known to this day, only 400 changed the meaning and only 50 were of real significance. For comparison, Bruce Metzger of Princeton estimated that the Mahabharata of Hinduism has only a 90% accuracy, Homer's Iliad at 95%, and the New Testament at 99.5%. The 0.5 does not affect any single doctrine of Christianity. Now that we have established that we do have an accurate copy of the New Testament writers wrote, we must now determine if they were telling the truth. And to analyze the authenticity of the author's words, we will deploy 8 pieces of evidence to determine how true the New Testament is. And this is all starting with the letter E. Let's start with the early testimony. How early was the New Testament written after the resurrection? We know that Jesus died on April 3, 33 AD, based on the day of Passover being held on Friday, which limits Jesus' resurrection to 33 AD, and that because other Gospels, especially John, records other Passovers, it must be 33 AD. And this is where I'm going to start. Right? We know that all the New Testament documents were written before 70 AD. Before 70 AD. This was because the temple of Jerusalem were destroyed at 70 AD by the Romans. In ancient times and now, the temple was seen as the place of God. It was the political and spiritual center for every Jew living in the area. Here laid the religious leaders and who led the politics and who came to commune with God. Now here's the reason why we know that the New Testament was written before 70 AD. It's because none of the New Testament documents cites the temple being destroyed, only signifying that the temple destruction didn't happen yet. Furthermore, Jesus predicts that the temple destruction. So if Jesus predicted that, the temple destruction would have been recorded, but it's not, making it logical to say that it didn't happen yet. And including the New Testament writers did say many times that the temple was fully functioning. So it does not make any sense that they would admit saying that the temple destruction actually occurred. But we can go earlier. Luke, the gospel writer of Luke and Acts, writes down Stephen and James, the brother of John, death down in Acts. But Luke does not write about Paul or James, the brother of Jesus, deaths. And we know that Luke gives incredibly accurate, and more on that later, incredibly accurate historical data. So if Luke's write down every single detail about Stephen and James, but fails to mention Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, that would only mean that it was written before it actually happened. And this is what exactly happened in Acts. The book ends when Paul was put into house arrest. And we know that Paul was killed by Nero, which his reign ended in 68 AD. And we know that Paul was killed in 62 AD. Therefore, Acts and everything that Paul has written must be before 62 AD. Right? And furthermore, the Gospel of Luke must be written before 62 AD, because according to the first verse of Acts, it says, in my former book, Theophilus, meaning that he already wrote Acts before. He already wrote Luke before he wrote Acts. Right? 62 AD is only 20 years after Jesus' death. But we can go earlier. There are books written within years of Jesus' death. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 ESV, Paul writes down the testimony of Jesus. In it, he uses the word received, meaning that Paul got his testimony, his creed, from somewhere else. Right? He got his testimony when he visited Peter and James in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. This is Galatians 1:18. Now, scholars date this creed to be written 18 months to 8 years of Jesus' death, putting it within the same decade as his death. Now, 1 Corinthians itself is dated around 55 AD, and the creed is within months. But this is not the only book that's dated to the 50s. Galatians was written in 48 AD. 1 Thessalonians at 50 to 54 AD. Romans 57 to 58. These dates are not disputed among Christians nor atheists. Now, John A.T. Robinson, a former critic and creator of the Death of God movement and the author of the book titled Redating the New Testament, states that most of the New Testament documents, including the Gospels, were written between 40 to 65 AD. Furthermore, William F. Albright, an archaeologist of the 20th century, says that, in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between 40s and the 80s of the first century, and quote, very probably sometime between AD 50 and 70. Now, it takes at least 2 generations for something to become legend, but the New Testament is written in the same generation as Jesus. Now, let's move on to eyewitness testimony. The New Testament writers claim that they were eyewitnesses many times. And let me quote, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Acts 2:32. You have killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are all witnesses of this. Acts 3:15. And here's the big one. That which was formed from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked at with our hands and have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. John 1:1-2. It is no secret that the authors claim to be eyewitnesses, but a claim and truth are 2 different things. So it is my responsibility to prove that they were actually eyewitnesses. Now imagine a famous journalist goes to your home city and begins to write down everything in this article about all the facts, all the locations, all the attractions, all the politicians, the weather, etc., all the culture. You would instantly know that he was telling the truth and that he actually visited your home city. And that's exactly what Luke does. Let's look at Luke. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts. Luke is not an eyewitness to the resurrection, but he is an eyewitness to the New Testament events. He did interview eyewitnesses, including Paul. Colin Hemmer, a classical scholar and a historian, identified 84 facts in the last half of Acts. Luke accurately displays knowledge of local places, names, environmental conditions, customs, circumstances that benefit only an eyewitness contemporary of that time and place. These 84 facts are listed right here. These 84 facts are listed out on these paper. These details are so precise that they are able to be confirmed today. Not the societal facts, obviously, but the geographical facts. Let me give you a case study. In Acts chapter 27, Luke records Paul's shipwreck. Now here's how the story went. Paul was a prisoner upon a ship heading from Crete to Rome. There was a wind called a northeaster, which grew and dragged the ship south. In the story, they were worried that they would hit Sardis, the coast of modern-day Libya. They turned the ship north and headed straight to Rome. After 14 days of sea, the sailors heard land. It was dark time, so they took measurements of how deep the ocean is. They measured it to be 120 feet deep. In a little while, they measured it to be 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would run their ship aground, they dropped 4 anchors. When daylight came, they cut the 4 anchors and left it in the sea and decided to run their ship aground to a sandbar. This sandbar, it was described to have a reef under it and where, quote, where 2 seas meet. Furthermore, they described the place they were at to be a bay with a sandy beach. Now, they did not know where they were, but through locals, they were told that they were on Malta. Malta is just south of of Sicily. Now, we know that this is true. Why? Because we have evidence that it is. Now, first, let's explain why the sailors did not know where they were. Because the storm dragged them south, they would have to head north. Therefore, they would come at the southeastern side of the island. Now, typically, Malta, people visited Malta from the north of the island. Why? Because there was harbor there, and it was closest to Rome. But because they landed on the southeast side of the island, therefore, they did not know where they were. Also, the storm in the Mediterranean, called the northeaster, was very common. It's very common for that storm to be lasting for 10 days and being very violent. Furthermore, there on the southeast side, there are a bay called the San Thomas Bay, where there is a sandy bay. It's sandy with a sandy shore with a sandbar that juts out. And that in the sandbar, there is a reef called the Moonchar Reef. Right? At the Moonchar Reef, there are 2 currents that collide together. In this bay, the depth is about 120 to 90 feet deep. Now, let me tell you, archaeologists have found the 4 anchors hidden there. Joe Navarro, a diver, found 4 anchors loaded in the San Thomas Bay at 90 feet deep. They were dated to the 1st century. These descriptions that Luke matches what archaeology says. Now, the geography and the meticulous detail that Luke incorporates into his story confirms that he is actually eyewitnesses. These are numbered 63 to 78. In fact, Roman historian A.N. Sherman White says, for Acts, the confirmation of its historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must appear absurd. Roman historians have taken it long for granted. Classical scholar and archaeologist William M. Ramsey, a former skeptic, said this after researching Acts, quote, I began with a mind unfavorable to Acts. It did not lie then in my line of life to investigate the subject minutely, but more recently I found myself often brought up into contact with the books of Acts as an authority to the topography, antiquities, and society of the Asian Minor. It gradually borne upon me that the various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Now, Acts also contained 34 miracles in the same book with 84 different eyewitness details. These miracles are confirmed by these 84 details. These miracles were not embellished and given no extravagance. They were told with the same narrative tone as the rest of the book. According to Frank Turek, a Christian writer, Luke's credentials as a historian has been proven on so many points that it takes more faith not to believe his miracles than to believe him. Now, how about Luke's gospel? Did Luke give the Gospel of Luke the same meticulous historical detail? The answer is yes. Now we know that both Acts and Luke were written by the same person because it was titled to Theophilus in both of them. Furthermore, he mentions Herod the Great, Caesar Augustus, and Quirinius when he writes in the beginning. And in the beginning of chapter 3, he writes this, quote, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and Trachonius, and and Lysanias, tetrarch of Albany, during the high priestess of Ananias and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. He went to all the country around the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance and forgiveness for sins. Now, anyone can already see why Luke is reliable. It's because he's putting historical crosshairs on the events. According to biblical scholar F.S. Bruce, a writer who thus relates his story to the wider context of the world is courting trouble if he is not careful. He's not careful. He affords his critical readers so many opportunities for testing his accuracy. Now Luke takes the risk and stands the test admirably. What Luke does is to attach his story to well-known politicians. And if he would lie, obviously those politicians will call him out on it. It is like me saying that Obama has blonde hair. Everyone would know that's an obvious lie. And this is what William Ramsey, the skeptic who launched a 20-year research in hopes of criticizing Luke, but instead saying, quote, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness, and Luke is a historian of the first rank. He should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Now, Luke is not the only witness to the gospel. John, the gospel writer of John, is also an eyewitness. John's gospel includes 59 historically confirmed eyewitness details put together by Craig Bloomberg, an American biblical scholar. I think I gave it to you. These 59 different details confirm that John was actually telling the truth. Now, because Luke and John have placed so many historical accuracies into their gospel, it may be proven that all the gospels are true because they corroborate together. Now, and we know that this is proven true because all the other gospels and all of Paul's letter include 30 other historical characters that are confirmed by archaeology and non-Christian sources. For example, Matthew mentions Herod the Great and his three sons, Herodas, Archelaus, Herod Philip, and Herod Antipas. Matthew also describes the man Herod Antipas killed John the Baptist, along with two women who instigated the killing, Herodas and her daughter. Mark tells the same story with Antipas and John the Baptist. And Luke extends the biblical citations of the Herodian bloodline by mentioning Herod the Great's grandson, Agrippa I, the king who killed John's brother, and the great-grandson of Agrippa II, the king who Paul testified. Now Caiaphas, a high priestess who sentenced Jesus to death, was mentioned by Matthew, Luke, and John. Caiaphas was confirmed by Josephus, a Jewish historian. Right. Furthermore, through archaeology, we have his bones. We know it's his bones because they are placed in a luxurious ossuary with the engravings of Joseph, son of Caiaphas, spelled in Aramaic. This was custom to Jews, and it was found south of Jerusalem. The bones date to a 60-year-old man. Josephus identified Caiaphas as Joseph Caiaphas. Just from John and Luke, there are 148 different eyewitness details that are confirmed today, including the rest of the New Testament. There will be hundreds more. But for the sake of time, to say that they were not eyewitnesses is to have more faith in that than to believe that they were actually eyewitnesses. Let me move on to elaborate testimony. We know that the New Testament writers did not collaborate when writing their Gospels. Most biblical scholars do agree that Matthew and Luke did reference Mark while writing their Gospels, but the differences in between them provide good evidence that the Gospel writers included their own experiences and accounts differentiating from Mark. This is especially true of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they do corroborate each other. These corroborations are so precise and small that they are often overlooked. For example, there may be an unanswered question. I will call a puzzle, but in another gospel, there is a puzzle piece that can answer the puzzle. These puzzles and puzzle pieces are evidence that the authors did not collaborate together to formulate a religion, but is actually the truth. These details are so small and so subtle to be planned or contrived. These puzzles interlocked with each other's eyewitness details due to how they fill in the gaps of each other's account. Here are some examples. Cambridge professor J.J. Brunt compiled over 60 of these undesigned coincidences within the New Testament, and also extra-biblical sources. Here are just 4. Pilate and Jesus. Luke records the Jews accusing Jesus to Pilate, quote, "We have found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied with, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I have found no guilt in him." Now here's the puzzle. Why would Pilate say that Jesus is not guilty when he just admits to it? Now, here's the puzzle piece. In John's gospel, Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate went back outside and told them, "I have found no guilt in this man." Now, putting all the pieces together, John offers extra information that's not found in Luke. But since in John's account, Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world, Pilate lets him go. Here's another example of elaborate testimony. Judgment for Bathsheba. Matthew records Jesus judging Bathsheba, saying, "Woe to you, Bathsheba, for if the mighty works done in you have been done in Tyre or Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth or ashes." Matthew 11:21. Now here's the puzzle. What are the mighty works done in Bathsheba? Matthew doesn't record them. Right? Now here's the puzzle piece. In order to figure out what Jesus did, we have to look to the feeding of the 5,000. Now here's the third example of elaborate testimony, and they will both come together. Now here's the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus asked Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that we may eat?" John 5:3. Now here's the puzzle. Why would Jesus ask Philip, a minor character, about where to get food instead of a leader like Peter or John? Now here's the first puzzle piece. Luke, and only Luke, mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred at Bathsheba. And here's the second puzzle piece. In another context, John records that Philip was from Bathsheba in Galilee. Now here's putting all the pieces together. Because Philip was from Bathsheba, Jesus asked him to buy food because he knew the area. According to Luke, Bathsheba was the location of the feeding of the 5,000. With these two puzzle pieces, we can tell that the reason why that Matthew left out the mighty work done in Bathsheba is because Matthew, instead of placing everything in chronological order, put it more thematically. Right. See, in Matthew, when Jesus curses Bathsheba, he curses him before he actually, let me rephrase this. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew put the curse before the miracle, indicating that the curse happened before, but that's not true because Matthew put his gospel thematically, not chronologically. Now here's the fourth example, and the fourth and final example I have. Joseph and Archelaus. Now Matthew records that Joseph had a dream in Egypt to return to Israel with Mary and child Jesus. And quote, "But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew from the district of Galilee and went and lived in a town called Nazareth." Matthew 2:22-23. Now here's the puzzle piece. Why did Archelaus scare Joseph? Matthew gives no explanation. Now here's the puzzle piece. According to Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, explains that Archelaus sent troops into the temple and killed 3,000 Jews. Passover was canceled. Now here's the puzzle. Now putting the puzzle pieces together. Joseph was scared of Archelaus because he was murderous, maniac, but this wasn't explained by Matthew. But the narrative given by Matthew matches perfectly to Joseph, two people who did not collaborate together. Let me continue. Embarrassing testimony. This is my next point. Let me ask you, if you are a sensible person, would you ever lie to make yourself look good? If you said no, you're doing it right now. Now let me ask you this, would you ever lie to make yourself look bad? No. Who would, right? Maybe you would do it for attention, but it wouldn't be good attention, because generally people would not lie to make themselves look bad. But in the New Testament, there are plenty of embarrassing details, and these details are presumed to be true because the authors would have no reason to invent something that would discredit or embarrass themselves. This is called the citation of embarrassment. So what details in the New Testament are embarrassing? Now, the New Testament authors are dim-witted. They numerously fail to understand what Jesus is saying, Mark 9:32 and more. Actually, I won't cite all of them. The New Testament authors are uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice in his times of need. Moreover, they never gave Jesus a proper burial. In fact, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very court that sentenced Jesus to die. Now, the New Testament authors are rebuked. Peter is called Satan. Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. Paul writes, when Peter came back to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly wrong. Now, keep in mind that Peter are one of the pillars of the early church, but here Paul is explicitly including this in Scripture, that he was wrong. Now, the New Testament authors are cowards. All the disciples but one, when Jesus goes to the cross, Peter denies him 3 times after explicitly promising that I will never disown you. Meanwhile, as the men are hiding for fears of the Jews, the brave women stand by Jesus and were the first ones to discover the empty tomb. Furthermore, a woman's testimony was not equivalent to a man's. So it would be unwise for somebody to say that the woman found Jesus if they were trying to make up a religion. But that did not happen. They were simply telling the truth. Now, the New Testament are doubters. Despite being told several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, they did not. Furthermore, the disciples are doubtful when they hear that the resurrection. Some are even doubtful when they see that he's risen. Now, that was the New Testament authors. Let me talk about some embarrassing details about Jesus. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his brothers and his mother. They come to seize him in order to take him home. Jesus is not believed by his own brother. Jesus is thought to be a deceiver. He is deserted by many of his followers. He turned off Jews who had believed him and point that they want to stone him. He is called a drunkard. He is called demon-possessed. He is called a madman. He had his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, an event that had a potential to be perceived as a sexual advance. Jesus is crucified by the Jews and Romans despite the fact that, quote, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. And Jesus has 2 prostitutes in his bloodline, Rahab and Tamar. I don't think the New Testament writers wanted to spice up his bloodline by adding 2 more prostitutes. But that's about Jesus. Now, what did he do? Jesus did some embarrassing stuff. He declares, the Father is greater than I. He seems to predict incorrectly that he's coming to earth within a generation. Then he says that the second coming, that no one knows the time, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son. Jesus seems to deny his own deity by asking the rich young ruler, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. He's seen cursing a fig tree, even though that it wasn't the season for figs. Jesus is seemed to unable to do miracles in his hometown, except heal for a couple sick people. Now, if the New Testament writers wanted to make up a false religion, why did they include such embarrassing and discrediting details about themselves and Jesus? Perhaps they were just telling the truth. Exigent testimony. Now, exigent means pressing or demanding, and that's how you can describe the New Testament. The commands that Jesus gives are very demanding, but yet, if the New Testament authors wanted people to believe in Jesus, then why did they put such demanding commands from Jesus, knowing that perhaps it may drive people away? Maybe because they were actually telling the truth. Now, here's a list of commands, difficult commands that Jesus gives us. He says, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in her and adultery with her in his heart. I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your coat as well. If someone forces you to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from those who wants to borrow from you. Quote, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your fathers in heaven. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Do not store up yourselves heavenly treasures. Do not store up treasures on earth, for where moth and rust destroys, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break and steal. For your treasure is where your heart will be also. Now here's the last one. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, non-believers say that faith is for weak people, or Christianity is just to believe that there is a God watching over you, giving you protection. But there's a lot more than that. As Christians, we're held to a greater standard, which we have all failed, but that's why we need Jesus to redeem us. See, nobody can look at the opposite gender without lust. Right? Nobody today will allow them to hit you. Right? Nobody today will be loving of their enemies. Do you get the idea? The thing is that if the authors wanted to convince a lot of people, they would have said, okay, you can look at women lustfully. Or if somebody attacks you, you can hit them harder, right? But the authors are simply telling the truth. And the truth is that Jesus did give difficult commands. Now, excruciating testimony. Excruciating testimony is the fact that the apostles did die as martyrs for their beliefs. There is a complete lack of evidence that the apostle lived to an old age, but rather they had lived until they were persecuted and killed. There is no evidence that they ever recanted their beliefs. Former atheist and cold case homicide detective J. Warner Wallace said this: every time you look at a criminal case, you have to look at the evidence that you offer and make a case against the defendant. And the defense attorney is going to offer his own set of evidence for their client's innocence. What is interesting to me is that the complete and utter silence of any ancient first century testimony describing the apostles as living long, extended lives, right. The fact of the matter is that all we have is repeated traditions related to the martyrdom. Now, perhaps my opponent would say, Alvin, you would die for your beliefs. How does that make you an evidence for the New Testament truthfulness? And yes, he would be correct. It makes no significance whether or not I would die for my belief. In fact, this is true for the Islamic martyrs. As sincere that they are, they make no evidential significance for or against their beliefs. What makes the martyrs different today than, from example, Paul or Peter, is that the martyrs today have to believe in their beliefs. They have to have faith. Now, Paul and Peter, they didn't need to believe. They already knew for certainty that Jesus was the Son of God. They were eyewitnesses, as discussed before. Their martyrdoms are therefore significant. Now, let's talk about some martyrs, Peter and Paul. Now, I would like to talk about all the martyrs, but I want to save some time. But before we talk about the persecution of Romans, according to Tacitus, he wrote about Nero, and I quote, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christus, who was from the name had his origin, suffered an extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of their procurator, Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, and we believe that is called that's called the resurrection, thus checked for the moment again, broke out not only in Judea, the first of the evil, but even in Rome, where all the hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest were first made to all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of firing the city as hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or nailed to crosses, or they were doomed to flames to serve as nightly illuminations when daylight had expired. Moreover, Suetonius says this: After the Great Fire of Rome, punishments were also afflicted to the Christians, a sect professing a new mischievous religious belief. Now, here's the context of what happened. Nero started a fire in Rome. He then blamed the Christians for it, and then proceeded to persecute the Christians by arrest, death by dogs, covered with the skins of beasts, nailed to crosses, and burned for light. This fire is called the Great Fire of Rome. Practice said, there is, quote, immense multitude was convicted. Peter and Paul were part of that. Remember back to the early testimony, Paul died in the early 60s AD, before 70 AD. Now the Great Fire of Rome occurred in 64 AD. And I quote, history has blamed Nero for the disaster, implying that he started the fire so that he could bypass the Senate to rebuild Rome to his liking. Much of what is known about the Great Fire of Rome comes to the aristocrat and historian Tacitus, who claimed that the Nero watched Rome burn while merrily playing his fiddle. Gangs of thugs prevented citizens from fighting the fires with threats of torture. Tacitus wrote, there is no majestic source of villas and pavilions. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. There is some support for the theory that Nero leveled the city on purpose. The Dominus era, Nero's majestic series of villas and pavilions set upon a landmark park and made a man-made lake. This was built in the wake of the fire. And I continue. It would have been very appropriate on the part of a Roman elite, says historian Eric Warner. They would have been happy if Nero had built the Dominus area out of the country, but to do there, the city was an extraordinary kind of statement. So what does this mean for the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul? According to Gusto Gonzalez, a Christian writer, says this: it is very likely that both Peter and Paul were among the Neronian martyrs. Oscar Coleman, a theologian, said this: we have the highest probability that Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome very soon right after each other. Right? Clement, a bishop of Rome, wrote to the Corinthians saying, quote, there was Peter, who, because of his unrighteous jealousy, endured not one but too many trials, and thus having given his testimony, went to the appointed place of glory. When Clement wrote this letter, it was a list of martyrs. Clement is a non-biblical source. Now, if Peter and Paul really died for their faiths, there's only three explanations. They were either liars, they were delusional, or they were telling the truth. We can both agree that nobody would die for a lie, especially when they know it's a lie, if or not it is a lie. These apostles are certainly these apostles knew in certainty whether or not the gospel's story is true or not. They were not delusional, and here's why. Blaine Pascal put it this way: the apostles were either deceived or deceivers if Jesus didn't really rise. Either superstition is difficult, for it is not possible to imagine that a man has risen from the dead. Now, while Jesus was with them, he could sustain them, but afterwards, he did not appear to them. Who made them act? This leaves us with only one option. The martyrs were telling the truth. Let me move on to expected testimony. Expected testimony speaks to the fact that there are documents and manuscripts before Jesus' birth predicting the coming Messiah. In 1946, a series of 12 caves found near the Dead Sea in the West Bank was found to be contained with thousands of manuscript fragments hidden by the Essenes, a Jewish religious sect that broke away from the temple authorities. Included with these fragments was the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is one of the Old Testament books. This scroll was 24 feet long and contains the entirety of the book. In Isaiah 53, it reads a messianic prophecy. This prophecy is extremely descriptive, calling the man, quote, no beauty or majesty, nothing in his appearance that should desire him. This refers to how Jesus was born a servant peasant, not a king. Quote, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man suffering with familiar with pain. He was despised and we held him to low esteem. This refers how Jesus was rejected by the Jews and casted him out as an animal, a criminal. He took up, Quote, he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his words we are healed. We are like sheep that have gone astray. Each one of us had turned their own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is just the first half of the chapter, yet it contained an entire gospel story. Now, if you take the other parts of Isaiah, starting from chapter 42, you get these descriptions. These were collected by Larry Hemler, an author. Number 1, he's elected by the Lord, anointed by the Spirit, and promised success in his endeavor. Chapter 42. Justice is a prime concern of his ministry. Chapter 42. His ministry is an international scope. Chapter 42. God predestined him to his calling. Chapter 49. He is a gifted teacher. Chapter 49. He experiences discouragement in his ministry. Chapter 49. He extends his ministry to the Gentiles. Chapter 49. The servant encounters strong opposition and resistance to his teaching, even of a physically violent nature. Chapter 50. He is determined to finish what God has called him to do. Chapter 50. The servant has humble origins with little prospects for success. Chapter 53. He experiences suffering and affliction. Chapter 53. The servant accepts vicarious and substitutionary suffering on behalf of his people. Chapter 53. He is put to death after being condemned. Chapter 53. Incredibly, he comes back to life and exalted above all rulers. Chapter 53 and 52. Now here's the question. When was this written? The great Isaiah scroll was dated to 125 to 100 BC. That is 125 years before Jesus. When you consider the Sputnik, a translation of the Greek to Hebrew Old Testament that include Isaiah 53, that was dated 250 years before Jesus. So the original must be older. Now the descriptions of the messianic prophecies matches the Dead Sea Scrolls, so much so that even Jewish rabbis admit that Isaiah is talking about a coming Messiah. Right? Their stance used to be that that passage was not talking about a Messiah at all, but that has changed. Now, if Isaiah was dated 250 years before Christ and seemingly got all the details right, what other prophecies are there? Genesis 3:15, the Savior will form from a seed of the woman. Genesis 49:10, the Messiah will be from the tribe of Judah. Jeremiah 24, the Messiah will be son of David and will be called God. Micah 5:2, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 9:67, the Messiah will be born a child but also be God. Malachi 3-9, the Messiah will come suddenly into the temple and will be preceded by a messenger. Daniel 9:25-26, the Messiah will die 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. That works out to exactly 33 AD. All these prophecies were written before Jesus. Now, these are not the only messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, but it proves that these prophecies prove that the New Testament is correct in all aspects of the New Testament. I'm almost done. Extra biblical testimony. As you know, my opponent will probably not take the New Testament as a credible source, despite it being accurate, and I have proven it true. So is there credible and reliable extra-biblical testimony? Now, there are 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life that corroborate basic New Testament storyline. These people are Josephus, Tacitus, Telephus, Suetonius, Emperor Trajan, Pliny the Younger, and others. When you compile their writings, we learn that 1, Jesus lived in the time of Tiberius Caesar. Number 2, he lived a virtuous life. Number 3, he was a wonder worker. Number 4, he had a brother named James. Number 5, he had claimed to be the Messiah. Number 6, he was crucified on the cross Pontius Pilate. Number 7, an eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. Number 8, he was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. Number 9, his disciples believed he rose from the dead. Number 10, his disciples were willing to die for that belief. Number 11, Christianity spread rapidly as far as to Rome. Number 12, his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as gods. This is exactly what the New Testament storyline goes. They did not believe in Jesus, just simply saying that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the grave. If they did believe, that would make them not extra biblical non-Christian sources. If people can agree that Caesar existed, why can we not Jesus? A man with 4 times as many sources and made the biggest impact to the world as anyone else, and yet there are still claims that Jesus never existed. Now I'm going to end with this. With all the evidence I've given that scrutinized and tested the New Testament, and it all passes. The immense amount of manuscripts that all corroborate each other proves that we do have an accurate and reliable account of what the New Testament writers wrote. Through the 8 E's, early eyewitness, elaborate, embarrassing, exigent, excruciating, expected, and extra-biblical testimonies, there is no doubt whether or not the New Testament writers lied. The fact of the matter is that they were telling the truth. Wholeheartedly, unbiased, and without motives, they simply recorded the facts about what happened, and they recorded this. Jesus, born from a virgin mother, who lived a sinless life, doing wonders and miracles across Judea, suffered and persecuted, rejected by many, flogged and beaten, mocked and conspired against, died suffering on the cross, despite being blameless. He rose again 3 days later and defeated the grave, ending the power of sin, so that you and I could be redeemed. It is not whether or not Jesus has forgiven you, it's whether or not you would allow Jesus to forgive you. Now, Jesus died so that we can live. We have broken God's law, but Jesus has come and fulfilled it. Jesus had paid our fines when it meant that he would suffer. What a wonderful story. Fortunately, this is not a story, it's the truth. C.S. Lewis put it this way: Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing that it cannot be is moderately important. I've proven that Christianity is true. It is now if you want to accept it. Thank you. This will be Raghav's turn.
Hello, I'm Raghav Jujare, and I'm going to prove why the Bible is widely inconsistent and parts of it cannot possibly be true. Now, I'm not saying the early Christians would have deliberately lied, but given the circumstances of the time, the Roman Empire, which expanded into Judea around 0 AD, was a melting pot of various cultures and influences. And during this period, the Jews, which had previously lived a somewhat more isolated life under the suzerainty of the Egyptians and the Syrians, were now exposed to vast new ideas and under repressive rule. These are conditions which led to the rise of new ideologies which differ widely and cannot be held as consistent. For example, I'm going to bring up the genealogy of Jesus. So, Jesus is said to be the Son of God, as in he was divinely conceived by God and Mary. Yet, why is it that Joseph's genealogy is also mentioned? Why do we need to be sure that Joseph was also descended from King David? Well, if Jesus was the Son of God, then his relation to Joseph is of no consequence. There's no reason to include it. But in the Old Testament prophecies, the Messiah is directly related to King David. Thus, there already is an inconsistency when the Christians try to call Jesus the Son of God, while also making him the son of Joseph. Now, let's look at another example on the Jesus entering Jerusalem. So, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says that 2 animals are used to bring Jesus into Jerusalem. Yet, the Bible verse that Matthew 21, 1-7 says 2 animals are entering. Jesus is seated upon a donkey and a colt. But what Matthew is trying to do is he's trying to draw a connection between an Old Testament text which states that the Messiah would be seated upon a donkey, even should it be a colt. He is making a translation error, and thus cannot be an eyewitness account of this. Another example is Matthew, in Matthew 2:1, states that Herod ordered the death of everyone under 2 in something called Massacre of Innocents. Yet Josephus, who recorded many instances of deaths caused by Herod, did not mention this in the slightest. Thus we can assume, since it's not been mentioned by another historian, it is false. Additionally, Luke states Jesus was born during the first census of Israel. The first census of Israel was under Roman rule from 6 through 7 AD. But Matthew states Jesus was born during the reign of Herod. Herod was dead by 4 BC. Thus, Jesus could not have been born during Herod's time and have been born during the census. So already, either Matthew is wrong or Luke is wrong. Another example of Christians putting historical inconsistencies in the Bible is how Jesus was crucified. In the Bible, it states Pontius Pilate had a custom of releasing a prisoner given by the choice of the Jewish people. Yet Pontius Pilate did not have the authority to release any prisoner. A Roman magistrate had at most the ability to delay a prisoner's execution on religious feasts. Yet Pontius Pilate supposedly ordered the release of the thief Barabbas while letting Jesus get crucified. Pontius Pilate had no authority to ever release any prisoner. It is inconceivable that a Roman magistrate would so deliberately break the law. Another example is how Jesus, when he's crucified, he is next to 2 thieves. Thieves were never crucified according to Roman law. The Romans had used crucifixion as a severe punishment for slave insurrectionists, religious leaders, and other revolters. A thief did not deserve the punishment of crucifixion. Thus, it is impossible that the Romans would have crucified 2 thieves and put him in the same realm of crime as a religious insurrectionist. Another historical inconsistency is, again, in Matthew's Gospel, 26:15, the chief priests weighed out 30 pieces of silver and gave it out to Jesus. There were no pieces of silver to be given out during this time. This was during the Roman period. Coins were used. The Roman denarii was not measured out. It was a standardized currency. The measuring of silver took place far earlier and was only during the early years of the Jews. This is an example of Christians attempting to draw connections between the prophecies of long ago in times of far before the Romans and trying to put them into the life of Jesus Christ, something that makes no historical sense. For more contradictions, Matthew states chief priests buy the field of blood, while in Acts, which was written by Luke, it states that Judas buys the field. Once again, we have 2 contradictions. Unlike what Alvin mentioned about puzzle pieces, over here there is no puzzle piece. There's 2 blatantly different statements, and both of them cannot be right at the same time. Thus, we have to establish that one of the early Christian writers lied, made a mistake, or simply was added, or the verse was added on later. For a more clear example of Christians dramatizing the text, we see in Matthew 27:5, it says Judas hanged himself. Yet in Acts 1-18, he bursts open and his insides spill out. This lucid description of Judas' death is simply for the purpose of dramatization, for one cannot simply hang themselves and then have their chest burst open. Another example that Christians changed the text of the Bible to suit support among the populace is how it states Jesus states that do not go into the way of the Gentiles. Do not enter the city of the Sarmatians, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is in Matthew 10, verses 5-6. But later, we see Christians evangelizing their religion to everyone in the Roman Empire. This is an example of how Christianity attempted to spread itself across Rome, which violates one of the sayings by Jesus in Matthew. Here's a more significant example of a contradiction within the very roots of Christianity. I assume most of you Christians believe that Jesus was born without sin. So, and baptism is the act of removing sin, of removing the original sin and bringing someone into the church, right? So why is it that Jesus went to John the Baptist and was baptized? Would it not be a waste, given that Jesus was without sin? So what we see here are Christians, the early Christians were changing their viewpoint, they were changing their texts to match the viewpoint of the later people in an attempt to diversify their audience. However, we have to consider why is it they did this? Why is it that Christianity changed so much? Was it not divinely inspired? Well, I mentioned earlier about how the Roman conquest of Judea opened it up to the trade and connections across the world. During this time, new philosophies in Persia were also arising, such as Mithraism, and the teachings of Zoroastrianism also spread into Rome. Now, the teachings of Mithra and Zoroaster stated there was a dualistic force of good and evil, where good was trying to conquer evil and evil was trying to conquer good. This dualistic vision permeated into Christianity, which differentiated it from earlier Jewish interpretations of the Bible. For instance, in the Old Testament, in the book of Job, Satan and God make a bet as to whether Job will denounce God after facing difficulties in his life. Now, if Satan was supposedly the enemy of God, then God would not even contemplate speaking to him. Satan would have been banished by God. Yet, the Jewish interpretation of Satan is that Satan is simply another angel of God. He is what God uses to punish the wicked. The Christians displayed, they took practices from other religions and tried to mold it into Christianity to appeal to a wider audience. By putting a force of good versus evil, not only do they blatantly disregard the earlier teachings of the Jews, but they also trying to match their beliefs to cults that are becoming more and more popular within Rome. We instead also have the case where Jesus says in Jonah, Matthew states, wait, let me find this. So in Mark 8:12, Jesus states, "No sign shall be given to this generation." But in Matthew 12:39, Jesus says only one sign will be given, the sign of Jonah. Jesus said, just as Jonah spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a whale, so would he spend 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But he only spends 2 nights in the tomb, Friday and Saturday, which is a contradiction in Jesus' resurrection. Now, speaking of resurrection, it is ridiculous how Jesus supposedly resurrected from the dead, impressive feat, and only the people who knew about it were Jesus' followers. Jesus, for some reason, did not appear to those who condemned him. He did not appear to Pontius Pilate and show that he is really the Son of God and has been resurrected. Such a demonstration would prove beyond doubt that Christianity was a true religion. But since Jesus does not do that, and instead is only said to have appeared before his followers, it raises doubt on the validity of his followers' beliefs. Did they simply make this up? Was it a hallucination? After all, if Jesus had really resurrected, it would have been recorded by other non-Christian writers during the time period. So when you're given all these examples of Jesus' accounts of his life contradicting with each other and with the established historical narrative, you have to believe that either the Christians made things up or that all the Roman texts were false. Now, the Romans were meticulous record keepers. They have so many records, so many non-contradictory statements of historical statements of events taken during the era that you cannot simply deny them out of hand. The logical assumption, then, is the early Christian writers made mistakes and contradicted each other because it was a new religion that lacked the appeal of old religions. Thus, the Christians needed to find new followers among the Romans. We have another Roman philosopher, Celsus, who states that when the Christians went after the poor and the weak and the sinners, that they were trying to find people weak at heart to convert them. For an educated person would not accept the teachings of Christ. Now, when Alvin mentioned that when the Christians stated harsh stuff in their teachings, like one should not look at a woman with lust, one should not, well, it was difficult for a rich man to enter heaven, then you should not assume that just because a teaching would be harsh, that it would not become popular. In fact, in times of trouble, many harsh teachings have emerged in popularity. For during the Protestant Reformation, for instance, the Calvinists who spoke of strict moral precepts and lacked the worldliness of the Catholics suddenly became popular. Just because an ideology is harsher in nature and lacks the easiness of previous ones does not mean it will find converts. Rather, a harsher ideology will find much more converts as believers think that it makes more sense and that it's like different from the time period's norms. So when you're given these examples of Christianity spreading, it makes sense, in fact, that when the Christians went to the Romans, they would change their teachings. This Christianity was influenced heavily by the Roman religion. When it contradicts with the Jews, it's clear that the Christians deliberately modify their teachings to find appeal among the Romans. Now, I'm not saying that this was done with malintent. For, say, when a Christian hears that Jesus was the Son of God, and they know in Roman and Greek culture that there were many sons of God, it was seen as one of the hallmarks of a divinely inspired person, they would choose to believe it over a contradictory source stating that Jesus was simply the son of Joseph. So it makes perfect sense that the narratives which contradict most clearly with the Jewish perspective began to take hold in the Romans. For the Romans, accepted ideologies more similar to themselves, as is the case of any religion adapting to a foreign culture. Now, another thing that has been mentioned is that the New Testament is more reliable than the writings of Homer and Demosthenes because more copies have been found. For this, I'd simply like to point out that during the reign of Emperor Theodosius of Rome, Christianity was declared the official faith of the empire and paganism was banned. During this time period of Christianity's primacy in the Roman Empire, Christian mobs destroyed many libraries of pagan works. For instance, the famous Library of Alexandria. It is disingenuous to claim that the New Testament is more historically accurate and reliable than statements and texts of previous eras just because not enough copies have been found. The reason why the copies have not been found is because they were burnt, not because they were of little historical value. So, Alvin, you can dispute each other.
Thank you for that. Now I will begin to rebuttal. As you did mention so many things, there's only so much time that I can go through any of them. So I'm just going to go through the stuff that I've heard. When you talked about Jonah, about that Jonah stayed in the belly of the fish for this number of days, but actually was this number of days, well, that's not because it was taken literally. Now, the story of Jonah is not supposed to be taken literally. The story of Jonah is a narrative. It's a narrative and it's narrative and a parody of how, as Christians, how should we believe? Now, the story of Jonah is basically that this prophet called Jonah refused to go prophesize to their enemies. Now, Jonah refused to go, and therefore he was stuck on a ship, and then he was eaten by a whale, but stayed there. Eventually, when Jonah went back and repented, he spoke a 5-word sermon, and suddenly all the kings and every people of their enemies were suddenly repented. Now, the story is not supposed to be literal. It's supposed to represent are we supposed to allow God to forgive our enemies? That's the whole point of the story, not whether or not Jonah stayed in the belly for this number of days or this number of days. And furthermore, in Jewish culture, days weren't counted by 24 hours. They were counted by when the sun set down. That was the next day, right? And this goes on with Jesus' resurrection days when we claim that it was 3 days and 3 nights. In reality, it was not 3 days or 3 nights, but they counted it as not literally 3 days or 3 nights. It was rather it was he's going to be buried, he's going to die on Friday and come back on Sunday. Now, you claim that the New Testament has all these contradictions, but the fact of the matter is that no, the Bible did not have contradictions. In fact, who is at fault is that people had made mistakes interpreting the Bible. Now, here are some common mistakes that people often make when they're trying to interpret the Bible. Number one, assuming that divergent accounts are contradictory. For example, it is not contradictory to say that if one gospel writer says that he saw one angel, but then another gospel says that there's 2. Matthew does not say that there was only one, but that at least there was 2. And if there was 2 angels, that's certainly at least 1, right? So this divergence does not mean contradiction. And this goes for the woman who went to visit the tomb, right? Who was the woman that visited the tomb? It's not, they are divergent accounts, right? Another common mistake that people often make is that the Bible approves of everything that happens that God approves of everything that is recorded in the Bible. That's just not true, right? The Bible records Satan's lies as well as God's lies. Or not God's lies, I'm sorry. As long as the Bible records Satan's lies with God's truth just as much. Right? You also pointed to Job of how you say that Christianity is a dualistic religion where there is a good and there is an evil. That is not the same account with Job. What happened to Job is that Satan had to be allowed to go but to test Job.
Alvin, you kind of misunderstood my point. What I was saying was that in Job, Satan was allowed by God, but Christianity states that Satan is evil, right? He's the enemy of God and was cast down, right?
Yes.
So why is it that Satan was allowed by God? The Jews say that Satan was just another angel of God, that God sent Satan to punish people, while Christianity, which was more influenced by the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, said that Satan was a force of evil and God was a force of good, and they existed dualistically against each other.
Thank you for interrupting me as I have interrupted you. The thing is that Christianity is not a dualistic religion. Even though, yes, Satan is the enemy of God, but that does not mean that the enemy of God has the same power as Jesus or God the Father or the Holy Spirit. They are not equal. In a dualistic religion, they would be equal, but they are not equal in this case. That's why Satan has to had permission from God to test Job. Now, the reason why Job was tested was because Satan asked God the Father, is he righteous because he has a lot of stuff, or is he righteous because he's truly righteous, right? And they both wanted to see. It is not because God didn't know what was going to happen, but it was because God already knew what's going to happen. That's why he allowed it to happen. Right? But the fact is that it is not a dualistic religion. Right? In fact, when you say that Christianity came from other outside religions and mixed with it, and that's what happened to the Romans according to you, that's just not true. In the Bible, it makes very clear in the Old Testament to separate yourselves from every people. That is why Joshua conquered the Canaanites, so that they would not be an influence on them. Unfortunately, that did not happen. But to say that they intentionally mixed with other religions is false. In fact, why would they mix with other religions? According to the Jews, they thought they were God's chosen people. Why would they mix with other religions? Right? When you talk about Celsus and weak people, saying that Christians targeted weak people, in the time, Christians were not in a position to go after anyone. As I've said before, they were persecuted. Nero, Dictorian, they all declared Christians an abomination, and they were hunted and targeted down. Right? That is why Paul, before he was Saul, he persecuted the Christians. But it took a divine encounter with Jesus to convince him otherwise. Right? They were already being persecuted in the Bible. Right? When we talk about Peter, when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, the reason why he denied Jesus was because if he said that he was with Jesus, he would also be crucified. And when you make the point that thieves would not be crucified because it's not a sufficient crime, no, this is not false. Because in Jewish culture, where they lived, in Jewish culture, crimes were punished severely. In Jewish culture, they had to be clean, as they called it. And to be clean is to be pure before God. But in Jewish culture, they had strict laws. They had some 600 different laws and commands given by God, right? So to say that thievery was not a severe enough crime would be false. Furthermore, thievery is against one of the 10 commandments. Those 10 are the big ones. Now let me get back to your contradictory details. The thing about contradictory details is that each author uses their own writing styles, metaphors, etc., but that does not mean that the Bible has contradictions. We often make the mistake of teaching everything in the Bible is literally when it's not supposed to be read literally. Some books are prayer, like Psalms. Some are songs, like Psalms of Solomon. Some are personal letters, like 1 Timothy. Some are for historically accuracy, like Acts. Some are law books, like Leviticus. They all have different purposes. Now, let me tell you this story. Imagine if you are a detective trying to solve a crime, and you have 2 suspects, and their testimony matches 100% completely together. You know that they would collude it together. But if their story matches in the same main details but differ on minor details, then you would know that they're just telling their own report. And that's exactly what the gospel writers did. They wrote down their own report and got the main ideas. Yes, they did differ on minor details, but that proves that they did not collude together or did not collaborate together.
Alvin, I have a question on the debate format. Don't you say your points and I say my points and then we argue back and forth? Right?
It was I rebuttal and then we talk to each other.
Okay.
On Calvinism, when you talked about Calvinists, you said that because the Calvinists had extreme or strict laws, it was not because they had extreme laws that made them Calvinists. It was because they were already in a organized religion. At this point in the Bible, at the New Testament, they were not a organized religion. They were a group of people, a minority in the Near East, in Israel. They didn't even have the Bible in the New Testament story. They did not have the Bible. They just had the Old Testament, right? But the reason why the difficult teachings of Jesus is true and points out to why Jesus was telling the truth and why the New Testament authors were telling the truth is because at the time they didn't know what was right and what was wrong. They didn't know that this was against the teachings of this was against the teachings. But when the Calvinists they were an organized religion. They actually did have the Bible and they could reference, okay, this is what we need to do. But back then, it was just Jesus. Now, as I've said, that there is no contradictions in the Bible. Yes, they may differ on different minor details, but that does not mean that they are contradictory. It means that we get a fuller report of what happened, and that's exactly what the Gospels writers did. Right? We know that Matthew and Luke reference Mark in their Bible, and John written later. And the reason why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar is because they were written about the same time, but the reason why John is different was because it was written later, and because John, he didn't reference Matthew and Mark, but he saw what was already written and filled in the gaps. Just because he filled in the gaps does not mean that they were minor details. He's just providing a fuller story. And that's exactly what you claim. That's exactly what happened. Thank you.
Okay. So, Alvin, you state that there were minor details that differed, right?
Yes.
So, what about the major details? Like, Matthew contradicts with Luke several times. For instance, Matthew says that Jesus was born during the time of Herod, who died in 4 BC, while Luke says Jesus was born during the first census of Israel, which was under Roman rule during 7 AD.
Do you have any evidence for that? Any
Matthew 2:1 and states that Jesus was born during Herod, and Luke 2:2 states that it was during the census.
Okay, and when was the census?
6 to 7 AD. And then
again, that's a minor detail.
The story of his birth is a minor detail?
The story of his birth is not about when he was born, it's that he was born. That's the main detail.
But was he born during Herod's time or later? Because having him being born after Herod was already dead is a major difference.
Scholars disagree on when Jesus was born. Oftentimes, people think it was 0 AD, but some scholars believe that it was earlier, and that the date of the actual 0 AD is wrong. But that's the most I would say, but that's what scholars believe, some scholars.
Also, you mentioned the 10 Commandments and how thievery was a big deal for the Jews, but this was under Roman rule. The Romans didn't care about Jewish laws or 10 Commandments. The Romans would not execute someone by crucifixion for being a thief.
The thing about is that the reason why the Romans succeeded was because they allowed the people that they conquered to continue their own cultures, and that's exactly what happened in here. The Jews were still allowed to keep their own culture.
Yeah, but the keeping your own culture did not extend to giving death penalties, like crucifixion, for thievery. This included, like, the Roman toleration of culture was praying to their own gods, those kinds of things, using your own language, not about executing people because what they did was against their culture, but not against Roman culture.
Nevertheless, Jewish law still applied. Doesn't matter if it was Roman law or it's Jewish law. The fact of the matter is that both Roman and Jews agree that thievery is a crime and a sin, right? And the fact of the matter is that it was punished.
Yeah.
Right? Both Roman law and Jewish law did agree that stealing was against the law.
Yeah, but Roman law put crucifixion only for slave revolts or religious disruptors, not for thievery. They would not agree to execute someone because one of their conquered people.
But that's what they did.
But no, only the Bible says that. No other Roman sources have any instance of a thief being crucified.
Because a thief would be insignificant. The reason why that the thieves were mentioned in the Bible was because it was connected with Jesus.
But crucifixion is a very severe punishment. It's only for important cases. Now, let me bring in...
The reason why they were crucified and not beheaded like Paul was because the Jews were not considered citizens. So they were given a more suffering death.
No.
Yes, that's why Paul was killed with a beheading and not a crucifixion, despite Paul being called a heretic or against the Jews, a heretic against Jews and being a Christian. The reason why he wasn't crucified and instead beheaded was because he was a Roman citizen.
Yeah, but the Romans still did not crucify people for being a thief.
It was the Jews. Remember that this time in this area, it was the Jews who ruled the area as well.
The Jews did not rule the area. The Jews were conquered. The Romans did not allow the Jews to...
The temple was still a political center at the time.
The Jews were allowed to practice their religion. The Romans allowed that.
And their policies. That's why all the Jews followed the 600 laws. That's why in the Bible it says that Jesus came to fulfill the laws, not to abolish it. Now, if at the time, if they didn't have to follow those laws because they were Jewish, and according to you, since the Jewish didn't have any real power, then why did Jesus have to say explicitly that he came to fulfill the law and not to abolish it?
No, because this was a Jewish community law. Even now, the Jews practice their own law, like not eating pork. But that doesn't mean that...
Even then, what is the main motivation for the Romans not to crucify or to not punish this thief?
Thief? It's because why would you be so extreme as to crucify a thief? The Romans had...
We know that they were brutal.
They were brutal, but
they were extremely brutal. They were professional killers.
But they had laws. Alvin, they followed the laws. Pontius Pilate was in fact recalled to Rome for breaking some Roman laws. Now, why would the Romans ever want a thief just crucified? This was serious crimes, like causing unrest in a conquered area. Jesus was crucified because his religious teachings were disrupting the community.
Yes, you're right, but my question was, what purpose why would it be wrong to crucify a thief?
Well,
do they not deserve what they get?
The Romans did not believe thieves deserved the penalty of crucifixion.
Do you have a source for that?
Yeah, you can search.
That is not a source. Tell me a source.
Roman law.
The thing is, it's like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not Roman law or Jewish law applied. It's that both law applies. That's why the Jews had their own culture.
The Romans did not enforce Jewish law.
Yeah, but the Jews enforced their own law.
Yeah, so why would Pontius Pilate order the thieves crucified as well?
Because Pontius Pilate was the prefect of Judea.
Yeah, he was a Roman person. Why would he enforce Jewish laws?
Because oftentimes Jewish law was harsher than Roman law.
Yeah, why would he just arbitrarily enforce the Jewish law that was harsher? Alvin, this was Roman rule. Romans would not just enforce Jewish laws.
But they did. That's the thing, that they did. Like, for example, why for Jesus, right? What was the purpose what was the motivation for the Romans? Right? The purpose why was the Romans motivated to kill Jesus?
Because he was spreading religious disunity among the Jews.
Yes, but why did that matter to the Romans if they didn't care about the Jews?
They were worried about a revolt.
Yeah, but Israel, at the time they weren't a big sect.
Christians? Well, the Jewish political leaders complained to the Romans about Jesus. He called himself the King of the Jews, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the Romans saw that as a challenge to their authority.
No, well, then explain why Pontius Pilate allowed Jesus to go free after saying, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And he said, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Well,
why did Pontius Pilate say he's guilty, innocent?
Well, I'm just going to say that Pontius Pilate could not order any criminal free. He didn't have the authority to do that. So I don't know why this is relevant.
Okay, then do you want to move on?
If you want to move on. Do you have a point for me or?
No, you can continue.
Okay. So we have, you mentioned about how the Jonah could not be taken say you cannot like literally.
It's a
it was
parody.
a metaphor. Yeah. Well, my point with that was that Mark 8:12 says Jesus says no sign shall be given this generation, but Matthew says only one sign. Why is there such a discrepancy?
What was it talking about? What's the fuller context?
I wouldn't know. I don't read the Bible often. I'm just giving a quote from.
What was the sign talking about? The sign of that Jesus was coming? Like what?
The Jesus was the Messiah. Right?
What's the passage again?
Mark 8:12.
Pharisees demand a sign. Verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit. Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Mm-hmm. And he left them, got in the boat again, and went to the other side.
Yes.
The reason why Jesus said that this generation will not be given a sign is because they were already given a sign, and the sign was Jesus, right? At this time, Jesus already did miracles, but the Pharisees rejected him. That's already a sign in itself. And the reason why the Pharisees demanded a sign was an insult. It's like, I am the sign, but you will not get another sign because I am the sign.
But you say he already did a sign with his miracles, right?
He already did so many signs with his miracle. That's proof that he was the Son of God.
But then why does he say no sign shall be given this generation? If he said that no more signs will be given, it's different than saying than just saying no sign shall be given.
It's because because the Pharisees didn't know that he was a sign.
Okay.
It's because the Pharisees did not know that Jesus was a sign. Looking back, we can look in hindsight that Jesus was the sign. But the thing is that they didn't believe that Jesus was a sign, so it would make sense to say that no sign will be given to you instead of saying that no more signs will be given to you.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, do you have anything now, or you still want me to go on?
I want to ask you, I know I already asked you this before, but how much evidence does it take for you to be convinced?
For me to be convinced?
I've already... Yeah.
Okay. For me to be convinced, I would like proof showing that I would like to have the contradictions within the Bible resolved. I would like to have proof that Jesus really did come back to earth. I would like to have proof that Christianity really is true as says in the teachings. One of the main reasons why I'm not convinced is, let's say that here's Deuteronomy 15:6. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. Well, I'm pretty sure the Christians were ruled over multiple times. Like the Ottomans took over vast areas of Christian land. And Egypt used to be Christian and was ruled by...
It's not talking about earthly rule. It's about a heavenly rule.
Heavenly rule over many nations? That
explains why God often calls his kingdom not of this world. It's because it's in heaven.
Alvin, it doesn't make sense to saying you will rule over many nations and none will rule over you. There's only a kingdom of God.
This is a prophecy of what's going to happen. Either it's referring to a heavenly kingdom or the second coming of Jesus. But again, this is Old Testament, so I don't say it's the second option.
Okay. Do you have anything else?
But again, I've given 9 pieces of evidence that points to why the New Testament is true. Yet it's so undeniable that you can't. Okay, then explain to me. How about this? There are extra biblical testimony that all corroborate the New Testament. Yet there are in total 42 sources that corroborate with the New Testament. 42 in total. 10 of them are non-Christian, extra-biblical. Now, for example, for Caesar, he only had 10 sources in total, right? But Christianity had 42 sources. Why does that not make any more difference?
Wait, are you saying there are only 12 sources of Tiberius?
There's only 10.
10 sources of Tiberius being alive?
Right.
It's because the Christian mobs burnt down a lot of libraries.
No, remember, it's Nero who persecuted them. Nero persecuted them.
What I'm saying is, Alvin, historically the Romans did persecute the Christians, right? Nero did them. But Christianity later became the main religion of the Roman Empire. Emperor Theodosius issued an edict banning paganism. There were like reprisals as well. Both sides persecuted each other. During this period, there was lots of religious persecution. So the reason why there are not as many sources of like Tiberius, for instance, is because during the persecutions, when the Christians started persecuting them, they were already in charge, and there was no, say, a pagan revival to challenge the Christians.
You said that you're talking about the Christians burned the Library of Alexandria, right?
Yeah.
In fact, this is not true. Alexandria was burned down by Julius Caesar in 48 BC.
No, the library was still standing during that time.
Well, nevertheless, it was not the Christians. It was Julius Caesar.
No. This Library of Alexandria was still standing after Julius Caesar conquered the country.
Nevertheless, it does not have any effect to the doctrine of Christianity. Now, we're not the question.
No, I'm just saying
the question of the debate is whether or not the reliability of the New Testament and was it telling the truth. It was not about church history. That's not about this debate.
Well, you mentioned that why am I not believing that your accounts are all true when there are more of your accounts than of Roman accounts. That was just why I mentioned that.
Why did you say that?
I just said that because you said that there are only 10 accounts of Tiberius, while how many of...
42.
Yeah, 42. I was just mentioning why. It's because the other ones are burnt.
Well, again...
It doesn't really have much to do with it. I'm just explaining why.
Again, the Romans... Dictorian, let me get my... I have too many pages. Here we go. The Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered Christians and manuscripts and all of them to be destroyed. But yet, why are there still 5,800 Greek manuscripts that are still alive today?
Which Roman Emperor?
Diocletian.
Wait.
He ordered a creed in 303 AD.
303 AD?
Yes. To destroy Christians, to destroy their books, their manuscript churches, etc. Yet, why is there still 5,800 manuscript copies? Now, if you say...
Wait. 303 AD, the Roman Empire was really split up. The emperor's weight did not carry much authority except for his soldiers, and many soldiers were Christian. He cannot expect...
But nevertheless, he ordered the decree, and it was enforced.
Yeah, enforced sporadically and not in full effect.
Yeah, but then at the time, Christianity was still small, right? But you say that they were still able to burn down libraries.
No, by the time they burned down...
That's why there was no sources of Tiberius.
Alan, when they burnt down libraries, they were already the majority. This was the Byzantine...
What year? What year is this?
This one, I think it's somewhere between 400 and 500. I'm not entirely sure, but it was after Constantine the Great.
Do you have any source?
No, you can search that. Okay.
No,
Alvin, anyone can just search it. These are historical facts. Now, okay, do you want to continue this, or do you want to move on to the Bible itself?
Let's move on to the Bible itself.
Do you have anything to say about that more?
No, I want to know your opinion. I already said my point.
Oh, okay. So another example is, really most of my examples are there a discrepancy between Gospel of Matthew, and like Luke. Can you just tell me more about the Gospel of Matthew and how significant it is?
The Gospel of Matthew is one of the synoptic Gospels. According to the two-source theory, it states that the Gospel of Matthew and Luke took reference from Mark and this another source called Q, right? And it was written, obviously, it was written by Matthew. It corroborates with Luke, which we know is an eyewitness, and put in eyewitness details into his account. So if Luke is the same as Matthew, right, then they both would say that they're both correct.
But wait, Matthew in verse 27:7 says, the chief priests buy the field of blood. And in Acts 1:18, Acts was written by Luke, and he says Judas buys the field. Was Judas a high priest?
No, Judas was not. And
So they contradict each other.
They're not contradictory, they're divergent.
Alvin. If there are two accounts of the same situation and are different from each other, they contradict each other.
Give me a second. Since Matthew 27:5-6 says that the chief priests used the betrayal money that Jesus threw in the temple for to purchase the potter's field, critics contend a contradiction that because in Acts 1:18 indicates that Judas purchased the field of the blood and money. Obviously, Judas cannot purchase the field because he was dead.
So Acts is wrong then.
There is again. Let me say that the accounts were different from people because Luke was not an eyewitness detail. It was not an eyewitness. He did interview eyewitness people.
You just said Luke was an eyewitness person.
No, he was not an eyewitness to the resurrection, but he is an eyewitness to many New Testament events. But he did also interview people. He interviewed Paul.
Okay. And you said the Bible has no contradictions. Do you want to revise that statement?
Give me a second. Can I get back to you on this?
Okay. Here's the more theological question. Jesus is without sin, right?
Right.
But
why did
he be baptized? Yeah.
Why would he be baptized?
Is it just a symbol? Well, you're a Baptist church, so is it just a symbol? Or
yes, we do believe it's just a symbol. And the reason why, actually, this is actually a really good question, is because the reason why that Jesus was given a redemptive baptism is not to say that he needed redemption. It was to give us an example of what we should do. It was an example of what we should do because Jesus lived the life that we should be an example of. And so the reason why he did baptism was to be an example for us to look at.
Yeah, I guess this point would really apply to your church. Let's talk about...
Well, even then, it doesn't matter because, again, in the story of the baptism, right, John the Baptist says that it should be you who should be baptizing me, right, indicating that John the Baptist knew that Jesus was sinless at the time, and he was still and it still is, right? But the story, regardless of if it was symbolic or actually wiping away the sins, it was just an example of what we should do, not that he actually needed redemption.
Okay. Do you have anything to say now, or?
No, I have all my points done.
Oh, okay. I want to talk about Joseph.
Joseph. Why was he mentioned in the genealogy?
Yeah, why? Why do we need to know that? Jesus is the Son of God, right?
They're mentioned because it's still biblical history. It's still history. The reason, for example, why did Acts need to mention, why did Luke need to mention all these different things? And as I give you the list of 89 different details, why did he need to mention that? He didn't need to mention that. The reason why he put Joseph there was because it is just because for biblical history to say that Joseph was his father, not biologically, but to say that Joseph was his father as a mentor or something like that.
So you're saying it was just put there?
It was put
just
there
to
for biblical history.
Just for history. And then, do you know the thing in the Gospel of Matthew where King Herod orders the massacre of innocents?
That was because there was a prophecy in around the time that, again, this came from the Old Testament, that there was a prophecy that Jesus would be born in Jesus would be born, right? And he saw this as a threat to his rule, so that's why he killed all of them. Well, the reason why he killed all of them is because he thought he believed that the Old Testament prophecy was true, indicating that he also had the Old
But
Testament
he ordered it, right? You're saying that
he ordered it because he was threatened by Jesus.
Yeah, okay. But Josephus makes no mention of this. Josephus made a lot of mentions of Herod's crimes. This one is really major, but Josephus just doesn't even talk about it. Why is it?
Because Josephus is not a biblical source. Again, I told you, Josephus is an extra biblical source. He's a Jewish historian, not a Christian historian.
But any historian would mention that a ruler tries to kill everyone under the age of 2.
No. The Bible didn't mention, again, like I said, Archelaus, why he murdered 3,000 Jews. Right? The Bible doesn't mention that. It's Josephus who mentions that. So it's like both of them do not mention. And again, as Josephus is a extra biblical source, right? The main idea, the main crux of where it came from is the Bible.
But wait, you said the Bible does not mention the killing of Jews under...
Exactly, but it was mentioned by Josephus.
So Josephus has a history of mentioning all of these deaths caused by deaths of Jews, right?
Right.
Yeah, why didn't Josephus mention...
Because you can't expect every single thing to contain every single piece of history. It's like imagining that your world history textbook contains everything about the world. No, it doesn't. It just doesn't happen. Remember, these documents written by the New Testament writers were not textbook size. They were just letters. They were not that big, right? And to assume that they should have included every single detail of history is false, because they weren't historians.
No, I'm not
they
saying
were just disciples. They recorded what they needed to record. Acts recorded the most because he thought, yes, the history does matter, and he did record everything, the small details. Explain to me how you say Luke. Explain to me why Luke has 89 details. Where would he get those details if you don't believe that he's an eyewitness?
Wait, what do you mean 89 details from?
I gave you that list of paper.
Yeah.
In that list of paper, it lists 89. I think it's 89. Correct me if I'm wrong. 89 different eyewitness details that only an eyewitness would know.
Oh, these 89. Most of them are about geographical details.
Exactly, geographical. If you say, exactly, that's the point. But the thing is, critics argue if critics argue that Christianity was just made up a religion, how did they get every single geographical location correct?
Whoever made it up knew
because
their geography.
They didn't have Google Maps. They didn't have any of that. So how would they know that there's a sandbar in Malta, or that the ocean deep was about 90 feet deep, or that there was a storm in the Mediterranean, or that there was a bay on the southeast side of Malta? Why? They didn't know these things. They did not have Google Maps, but somehow they did know it. And I'm telling you, I'm asking you, where did they get this detail if they made it up?
They either heard about it or they saw it themselves.
All 89 of those, exactly. Yes, they either saw it themselves or they interviewed eyewitness people, and that's exactly what Luke did. He interviewed eyewitness people who included their own historical crosshairs. That's why there's 89 different details.
But We acknowledge that Luke is wrong, though, at times.
When?
The field of blood. So we can't take everything Luke says to be true.
Yes, but what he says is unmeasurably. But the evidence that points out to him is too great to believe that he was lying.
But we know he's lying once.
Right, but
why can't he lie again?
Luke was the writer, but he interviewed others.
So the interviews of others are of doubtful accuracy then?
No, the interviewed of others were the people who Luke interviewed first is not. I'm not sure, but I know it was Paul later, and that's when the 89 different details come up. It's from the last half of Acts. Those 89 are from the last half of Acts, and that was written by Paul, or not written by Paul, but like he was interviewed.
But see, most of these are like their names of ethnic groups of people living there.
Exactly, and when I said that if imagine a journalist would come and name all your ethnic groups and all the names and the culture and the society and the topography and all the weather, you would instantly know that person actually went to your home city or interviewed somebody that went to your home city, right? And that's exactly what those 89 details are. They're characteristic that only a person living in that time and only those people who living in that culture would know. That's why those 89 details are so important. And again, those are not the only 89. Actually, I forgot to give you. There is actually more. This is John. He did not include too much topography or geographical, but he did include eyewitness details. John has 59 details.
About high priests and, yeah.
These are things that only people living at that time would know.
Okay, but Alvin, say to bring your example of why would someone who knows all these details lie about something, I was going to bring the example like in a court case, right? A witness, say even a witness who lies should know their surroundings, right? They've lived there, they've seen it. Doesn't mean they can lie about other things, or maybe they misread or misheard.
But according to you, that Luke has to lie. Luke has to lie 89 different times. And
I'm not saying all of them are false. I'm saying there's credible doubt on a lot of them.
Yeah, but they are verifiably proven. They're historically proven through archaeology, and that you can look at them right now. The geographical facts, you can look at them. When you go home, you can go to Google and look at the geographical facts. They're verifiably proven.
Yes, we know geographical facts can be proven, but
the
just
historical facts are
just
also
because
proven through archaeology.
Alvin, you're making a false equivalent. Just because that geographical stuff can be proven does not mean that everything else he says can be true, especially when we know that something he wrote was false.
Again, they are divergent accounts.
There are contradictory accounts if they're divergent.
But even if they're contradictory, that does not mean that the entire Bible is false. It's a minor detail. That's not the main point of Acts. The main point of Acts is to talk about the disciples, what happened to them, and where did they go? How did they spread the gospel? That was the main point of Acts. These are the point of who spent the money or this or that, are taking small and minute details about the New Testament and saying that all of it is wrong. Just because one typo is wrong doesn't mean the entire book is wrong.
This isn't a typo though or anything. It's
a small detail.
Okay, let's talk about the field of blood, right? How did it even get its name? Matthew says it was purchased with blood money in Matthew 27 verses 6 to 8.
Again, I don't know much about this.
Oh, okay.
I'm not a biblical scholar.
Okay, but we're gonna kind of have to debate biblicals.
But you have debated church history. Just before, you have all you have done is debated church history. And when I did give you an answer to contradictions in the Bible, you did not accept it.
Wait. Your answer was that they're all minor details.
They are minor details, but then that proves that the eyewitness details are that they proved that the gospel writers did not corroborate. Do you think that the New Testament authors got together at a meeting table and said, okay, we're going to include this in the Bible, include that, or what are you going to include? So that you don't believe that, huh?
No.
Exactly. So if that didn't happen, then why did the entire gospel match so perfectly? Why is there so much elaborate testimony within each of them if they did not collaborate together? Isn't that a miracle in itself? And to say that these minor details disprove the New Testament, that's wrong. But then you admit that they didn't collaborate together, but somehow they got the New Testament so similar. But when you take one small tiny detail about the New Testament and say, oh, this attacks the entirety of it.
Well, wait.
If here's the question: if the New Testament writers did not collaborate together, why did they agree on so much things? Why did they agree on so many things? Was it possibly because it happened and they were just telling their own report?
No, I'm not denying that I'm not denying the existence of Jesus. I believe it's perfectly reasonable that some actions of his life are true.
Okay, then let's talk about we don't need to talk about the existence of Jesus. Let's talk about his miracles, right?
Yeah.
They agree on the miracles that Jesus did them, or they did this, or the feeding of the 5,000, healing of leopards, right? Right. Those. Why don't you agree on those if you say that Jesus existed?
Well, Jesus existed. It's not a controversial point to make. You can always say that someone named Jesus existed.
Okay, if Jesus existed, then why is there... If Jesus existed but didn't do miracles and didn't resurrect from the grave, then why are there so many Christians in the world?
Why are there so many Christians in the world?
Think about this. If they were to publish Acts or to publish this or that or the New Testament, couldn't anybody just take a look at the New Testament and says, okay, this fact is wrong. This
Alvin,
is wrong.
You see, Celsus just describes this in what you say.
Celsus
Christians went after the uneducated people. They went after the weak. They went after the poor. During this time, a lot of people were living in hardship. Christianity gave the people hope. You can't deny that, right? They're not going to check the Bible for errancies. In fact, most people do not even read the Bible. Very few people have literacy. You can't expect the Bible to be read by everyone. Very few biblical scholars even read the Bible in the first place. Most of the Christian teachings were delivered word of mouth. They can't just look at the Bible and see this is an error, this is an error. Celsus says that's why educated Romans do not become Christians, because they looked at the Bible and thought it was ridiculous.
Celsus is not a credible source, as you have said before that he wrote his observations in 175 AD. That's over three generations afterwards. Let me continue. You say he's a Eutychian, right?
Epicurean.
Yeah. That was disproven. According to Origen, Epicurean were despised and not respected in society at the time, in Roman and Jewish society.
Well, Origen can't be a credible source on this. It doesn't matter if he was Epicurean or not. It's because how does it matter?
Celsus got his work from Plato, correct? But nobody would question Plato, but he wouldn't question Plato, but he questions the New Testament, right? So why is that? Tell me the hypocrisy there. Why did he not question Plato, but he questions the New Testament?
Because Plato was. If you look at Plato's works, they used logic, and it was easy to follow and just jump to the same conclusions as Plato did. A lot of church people also try to use Plato. On the other hand, the Bible, like believing that Jesus rose from the dead or Jesus turned water into wine, it requires faith, right? You have to believe in it. You can't just say it's right.
People at the time, they did not need to believe in it. They already knew it happened. That's the thing.
No, but you said, how are there so many Christians and all? Not all those people could have just seen miracles happen. Most of the reason why there's so many Christians and all is because Christianity became the official religion of the empire.
Right, but again, if it doesn't matter if it became the official religion of the empire, if it's possible to check whether it's true or not, and there were people that did check if it was true or not, right? These church fathers, they knew.
These church fathers disagreed amongst themselves. There were several councils to even identify which books were canon and which books were not. And some groups of Christians there were major divisions. Some groups of Christians called Arian Christians even broke away from the church, and there is wars between the two. The reason why we have a codified Bible today is because the Emperor Constantine enforced these books.
Again, this is talking about the canon, but the canon doesn't have anything to see. The 7 apocryphal books. I think it's 11 actually. The 7 or 11 apocryphal books were forgeries.
How do you know they're forgeries?
Because they were written centuries, and their accounts do not match the New Testament. Do you want me to give you an example? This is why Martin Luther took them out from the gospel. This is from the Gospel of Peter, and there is no such thing. We don't believe that there is such thing as a Gospel of Peter. And this is talking about finding the tomb. And I quote, early in the morning, as the Sabbath dawned, there came a large crowd from Jerusalem and surrounding areas to see the sealed tomb. But during the night, before the Lord's day dawned, as the soldiers were keeping guard 2 by 2 in each watch, there came a sound in the sky, and they saw the heavens open, and 2 men descended with shining great light, and they drew near to the tomb. The stone which had been set on the door rolled away by itself and moved to one side, and the tomb was opened by both of the young men. And the tomb was opened, and both of the young men went in. Now, when the soldiers saw this, they woke up the centurion and the elders, for they were also keeping watch, while they were telling them things that they have seen. They saw 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them sustaining the other one, and the cross following them afterwards. The heads of the 2, they saw the heads that reached up to heaven, but the head of him that was led went beyond heaven. And they heard a voice out of the heavens saying, have you preached unto them that they sleep? The answer that was heard was the cross was yes. That's the Gospel of Peter, and we know that's false because it's so obvious that it's given extravagance or embellished. Now here's what the Gospel of Mark says. There is no embellishment here. It's still told with the same narrative tone. And I quote, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where you laid him, but go. Tell your disciples and Peter. He was going ahead of you into Galilee. There you would see him, just as he was told. Trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb. Right? You can see that this was not embellished, but the first one was embellished. That's why there's different. That is why, as Protestants, we don't accept the apocryphal books because they were forgeries. They were written centuries after. Right? How plagiarism worked back in the day was not that you would copy somebody's writing and put your own name. What they did was they would write something, then put the name of someone respected, like Peter or Judas or Thomas, and that's what they did.
Yeah.
But obviously, the teachings of the apocryphal books the teachings of the apocryphal books are not corroborated with the New Testament canon. In fact, Jesus does not mention any of the apocryphal books. Jesus does not mention the apocryphal books. The main sources that Jesus mentions is Exodus, Isaiah, Psalms, and one other, but I forget. Oh, and Ezekiel. Right.
But wait, the Bible wasn't even fully written when Jesus was there, right?
The Old Testament was.
The Old Testament, yeah, but the New Testament stuff, like Jesus is not referenced. Does Jesus reference Luke or Paul?
No, Jesus does not mention them.
Then you can't just say
because they weren't written yet, obviously.
Yeah, the other ones also weren't written.
Yeah, but the Old Testament was.
Yeah, but you can't just say that.
I'm saying that Jesus did. No, let me tell you, the Exodus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Psalms are Old Testament, by the way. Did you know that?
Yeah,
Old Testament.
But you said that.
No, they mentioned Jesus. No, you must have heard me wrong. Jesus quoted the Old Testament, not the New.
I know. But you said that those apocryphal works.
Apocryphal books were written centuries after after the resurrection.
And one of your proofs was that Jesus did not quote them.
No, well, some of the apocryphal books were Old Testament too.
Okay. Just want to clarify that. Now, you mentioned something about embellishments, right?
Yes, embellishments.
And how one of the reasons why you said the Gospel of Peter is wrong was because it embellished the story.
Right.
But look,
when we say embellish, it's to say that it was given a different narrative tone as the rest of the book.
Yeah, here's another different narrative tone as the rest of the book. Matthew 27:5. Judas hangs himself. Acts 1:18. He bursts open and his insides spill out. Is that not a different narrative?
Again, these are different reports from different people. Again, these are different. These are people who did not collaborate together.
But you can't put puzzle pieces together. These are vastly different accounts, though. Like, one of them has to be wrong. Listen, Alvin, one of them hangs himself. The other guy says he bursts open. One of them has to be wrong. One of them has to at least lie somewhere.
Again, I will get back onto you on that.
Okay.
But we should end in 4 minutes, by the way.
Okay, so what was the first thing you were going to get back to me on then?
I will get back to you on the field, the blood, and whether or not I'll get back to you. I'll just get back to you on the contradictions in general.
Yeah. Also, your Southern Baptist Church holds that the Bible is inerrant, right?
Yes.
Right. Well,
again, divergent details are not contradictions.
I'm pretty sure if two things talk about the same event but mention different, there are differences. No matter how slight, it is a contradiction, and it violates the principle that the Bible is inerrant.
All right.
Okay.
Are we done?
Yeah.